you can see. Fantastic. Okay, well, I am Megan Gimber. I work for a conservation charity called People's Trust for Endangered Species, where I am the key habitats officer. So my main focus is hedgerows, and it's fair to say I am quite hedge obsessed. This photo is of me trying to camouflage myself in a lovely hawthorn hedge full of berries. So I'm aware that hedgerows, of course, aren't in fact an endangered species themselves, but it's a habitat that fits really well with the work that we do as a charity, because we focus on a number of species such as hedgehogs and dormice that really do depend on the health of our hedges. So this talk is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour about hedges. It's going to be a bit about their value to wildlife, their value to landowners, a bit about their history, their health, and quite a lot about how we should be managing them. I will speak relatively fast because I've got quite a lot to say in a short amount of time. But if you can't hear me, do let me know and I can slow down a little bit. So first, some context. Sadly, we're facing a bit of a double threat of a biodiversity crisis and a climate crisis. So unfortunately, I can't sit here and tell you that hedges are going to solve either of those, sorry. But I hope to be able to convince you that they are a really good place to start, and they should absolutely be considered as part of our larger arsenal. So 70% of the UK is agricultural land. And really what we do within that is hugely important to our native wildlife. So, of course, as a conservation charity, we're primarily interested in hedgerows for their value to wildlife. And this value is incredible. A great example I like to use is their value to dormice, because they were one of the initial drivers for our hedgerow work. So we estimate we've lost about 50% of our dormouse population since the year 2000. And we know they've gone extinct from 17 counties in the past 100 years. So it's fair to say they're in a bit of trouble. So as part of what we do with dormouse conservation, we do some reintroductions of dormice to areas of the country where they have been lost. And before we do this, we need to make sure that these new populations are not isolated and that they have really good connectivity to other dormouse populations. And it's just really important, as this connectivity can allow dormice to maybe inhabit fragments of woodland that might otherwise be too small to support a viable population. It can help gene flow between dormice populations in different woodlands, and it can allow dormice to move across the country, maybe finding new suitable habitat, moving out of habitat that's become unsuitable. And sadly, the effect of climate change may make this ability for dormice to be able to relocate increasingly important. So dormice are arboreal creatures, which means they don't really like scurrying across the ground. They much prefer to cross through branches. And it's hedgerows that provide the safest way for dormice to cross our countryside. Incidentally, although it's not their primary habitat, hedgerows are actually also capable of sustaining breeding populations of dormice. But to do this, they need to be healthy. They need to be large, they need to be species rich. So dormice eat a variety of foods throughout the year. This might start with flowers, maybe turning to small insects, then maybe ash keys, blackberries, and then nuts to help fatten them up for winter. And what's really great about dormice is that if we get hedges right for dormice, who by all counts are fairly fussy little creatures, we'll have created a habitat that can support a broad range of other species, as well as hitting many other values as well. So that's where we started, but it's fair to say that our commitment to hedgerows goes far beyond any individual species now. So why are hedges so great for wildlife? So as far as I see it, they provide three main roles. So firstly, a physical home. So from nesting birds, hibernating hedgehogs, dormice and other small mammals, to things like insects and beetles and butterflies. So one study counted 2,070 different species in just one 85-metre stretch of hedge in Devon. 2,070. So the author of that study, Robert Walton, says that even he thinks this is an underestimate of the true number, because he was only counting species that you could see with the naked eye. And this was just in one 85-metre stretch of hedge in Devon. So imagine what they might hold nationwide. Secondly, they are an excellent complementary habitat. So this is one that's not necessarily home, but plays an important role in life. So this could be such as food, such as like leaves, flowers, berries, or insects, or it could be shelter from predators or from the elements. So a massive 84% of our farmland bird indicator species make use of hedges, but actually for only 52% of these is it their actual physical home. The rest use it as a complementary habitat. And thirdly, and importantly, they are used as wildlife corridors, as I described for dormice. So these help connect populations that would otherwise be isolated and vulnerable. And it's not just arboreal creatures like dormice, but it's important for things like bats, and even for things like flying insects like butterflies and moths, many of which make use of the warmth and the shelter created by a hedge to allow them to get their body temperature up enough to fly. So hedges are a man-made, man-managed habitat. So it might actually seem quite odd that they are so good for wildlife. But while they're not a sort of natural habitat, actually in structure, they're what we call an ecotone, which is where sort of two or more habitats overlap. And in this case, their structure mimics that of a habitat like a woodland edge. So in this photo, we've got one side is the edge of a woodland and the other side is a hedgerow. And I took this photo and I can't tell which is which. So for hedges, we've got overlapping elements of woodland, scrub, and grassland. And while it certainly doesn't replicate any of these habitats fully, it does mean it's capable of supporting many species from each of them, like 80% of what we would normally call woodland bird species. And for some species, they're actually greater than the sum of its parts, because many species actually rely on all three of these elements. So I think a really good example of this is the song thrush. So the song thrush will sing from hedgerow trees. It will nest in the dense hedge structure. It will feed on snails and worms in the hedge base, especially if there's a nice wet ditch down there as well, before moving on to eating hedge berries later on in the year. And actually, if you look at our native ecology, the more species you'll find thrive in this woodland edge habitat than you might have thought. Why? Well, an alternative theory to the closed canopy theory, which is what we were all taught in school, that a squirrel could merrily hop from tree to tree, Land's End to John O'Groats. An alternative that is that the ancestral state of this island was actually more of a mosaic, including woodlands, but also glades and scattered trees and areas kept open by large herbivores. And all of this alongside plenty of scrub. And it will all be in a flux at different stages of succession. And of course, things weren't neatly sectioned off as they are today. So basically, we'd have a lot more of this sort of characteristic woodland edge habitat. And of course, if this is what our ecology adapted to, it may help explain why the cultural habitats that mimic this structure, so hedgerows, wood pasture, traditional orchards, are all so rich in wildlife, especially for a man-made habitat. So if anyone tells you that hedges aren't important because they're just a human invention, they're not natural or old, just ignore them. So let's have a closer look at the structure of a good hedge. So for wildlife, a good hedge has a diverse shrub layer. So hedges with more plant species have a higher diversity of invertebrates and birds, partly because each plant species will have things that specialise on feeding on it, but also because it tends to mean you get a better year-round availability of food sources. They all flower and fruit at slightly different times of the year. Next up, the size. So generally, increasing the height and the width of a hedge tends to increase both the diversity and the abundance of wildlife within it. So not only do sort of wider, taller hedges provide more hedge sort of volume, but actually it also increases the complexity of the habitat. And more complex hedges provide better shelter for foraging birds, reduced predation from nesting birds, And so although hedges, as we'll get to later, should always be managed on a cycle, which will include cutting and will include rejuvenation, increasing the average size of a hedge within that cycle is a really good idea for wildlife. Next up, we've got structural complexity. So some species, like the song thrush, need several aspects of hedge features throughout their life cycle. But you can actually take this a step further too. So given that different species have slightly different needs from a hedge, ideally we want to see lots of different hedge structures represented across our landscape at any one time. And happily, this is one of the many benefits of managing hedges on rotation, which I'll talk about in a bit. And then, of course, as with dormice, good connectivity is vital. Corridors play a vital role for species that are at risk from fragmentation. So fragmentation of a habitat is the limiting factor to the distribution of some of our species in the UK, and it's even thought to be a threat to survival of some others. So hedges that don't have large gaps and those that connect other good habitats across the countryside are particularly good for this, what we call habitat connectivity. And of course, a margin at the base of the hedge not only protects the hedge roots from disturbance, but is also fantastic for wildflowers and grasses, which is really very useful for our small mammals, for birds, for feeding, for protection, and the like. And lastly, I think they deserve a slide to themselves. The last feature of a good hedge is hedgerow trees. So they're absurdly valuable in hedges. Over half of the priority species that are associated with hedgerows are dependent on hedge trees. So they provide songposts and territory markers for important bird behaviours. They provide nesting opportunities for birds, bats, and more. In a year where a hedge has been cut, a hedgerow tree can still provide the flowers and the fruits that a recently cut hedge itself can't. Then, of course, old hedgerow trees, especially like the old pollard trees that you'll often find in ancient hedges, can provide really valuable dead wood habitat for all our very rare dead wood dependent species. So we don't know much about these species, but we do know we've got at least 2,000 different dead wood dependent insects in this country. And of these, at least 320 are known pollinators, but it's likely to be a lot higher than that. So sadly, we lost a huge number of hedgerow trees to Dutch elm disease, and we're in the process of losing more to ash dieback. And unfortunately, we're not establishing enough new hedgerow trees to accommodate these losses. So the bottom left of this screen is an old snip from an Ordnance Survey map. And beside it, there's a satellite image of what this land looks like now. So obviously we've lost a couple of hedges in there, but what is just as striking to me is the loss of mature hedgerow trees, which are those blobs sort of indicated on the map on the left. And they're almost all gone, as seen in the satellite imagery. So at a time where tree planting is, it's all the rage, I would say establishing trees in hedges seems to be a complete no-brainer. It doesn't take any land out of food production. They form open grown trees, which have huge wildlife benefits. They could be managed for timber, for wood fuel, for additional crop production. They could be coppiced, pollarded, or left as hedge standards. If you're worried about crop shading impact, you can use small tree species in your east and west hedges. And then, of course, you can put your larger tree species, such as oaks and beeches, in your north-south hedges, and these will have sort of added benefits of wind protection. And of course, you can establish hedge trees for free through natural regeneration. So just tag suitable young candidates and spare them from the trim. And this actually has some really good added benefits, particularly the benefits of preserving the genetic diversity that's present in your local tree populations. So genetic diversity is crucial defense of any species against the unknown threats of the future. So an example, one oak may be naturally better in a drought condition. Another oak may have genes that make it better able to tolerate floods. And a third may have some natural resistance to whatever new tree disease may be on the horizon. and sadly we seem to have quite a lot of that. So certainly preserving this diversity, this genetic diversity of our tree populations should be a priority. But of course, you can also plant trees, and call me an optimist, but whenever I see a gap in a hedge, like the bottom right hand of this screen, I always just think it's the perfect opportunity to put a new hedgerow tree in there. You don't even have to do any coppicing. And all the while, hedgerow trees provide benefits for wildlife. They're storing carbon, they're cleaning our air, they're reducing flood potential, and I think adding greatly to the beauty of our countryside. So the origin story of a hedge can have a huge impact to what it looks like, what nature it contains. Not all hedges were born equal. So the oldest hedges that I know of are down in Cornwall, and I think some estimate these to be about 6,000 years old, which absolutely blows my mind. Cornish hedges are stone-faced banked hedges, which gives a wonderful new set of niches itself. And then we have other hedges, which we call assart hedges, which are the boundaries that were left as fields were literally cut from woodland. So these hedges often have fantastically diverse species in them and represent the ancient diversity of the woodlands from which they were cut. So you'll often find ancient woodland indicator plants in assart hedges, which isn't really surprising, really, given that they are literally the remnant of very ancient woodland. Then, of course, there are banked hedges in the West Country with woody growth on the top and a bank below, and often wildflowers up the bank sides. And of course, we've also got things like enclosure hedges. So these were planted as part of the land enclosures where common land was hedged in. So this went on for about 500 years. But peak enclosure was between about 1750 and 1820, and about 200,000 miles of hedging was planted in that time. Enclosure hedges tend to be single species hedges, mostly hawthorn, planted in very boring straight lines, and are very common around the central part of the country. But they are also still absolutely fantastic for wildlife and definitely in need of protection. But obviously, some hedges are in better shape than others, and the management that they see has a huge impact on their structure and on their capacity to sustain wildlife, and even their capacity to act as effective wildlife corridors. So this picture, the level of fragmentation that you see here, obviously makes it nearly impossible for animals to use these hedges for any of their three main purposes. So we went through some dark decades of incentivized hedgerow removal after the war, and we estimate that we've lost up to about 50%. And many of these can actually still be seen as sort of shadows in the countryside, which you can sort of see on the right-hand photograph. Incidentally, this snip and the one before comes from a fascinating website which shows old Ordnance Survey maps side by side with their satellite images. So the link is on the screen. It is a fantastic website, but it does come with a warning that it is very, very addictive. So I'm glad to say that the outright removal of hedges seems to largely be behind us, especially in the agricultural sector. And it's now brilliant how many hedges are being planted, more than I've ever seen before, which is fantastic. But I would say it's worth remembering that what we have now shouldn't be considered the baseline, considering how many we've already lost. That new hedges don't adequately replace the value of old ones, at least not for quite a long time. And then given the historic loss, I would say it's more important than ever that our remaining hedgerows are kept healthy. But sadly, we do still risk losing many of our hedges, largely through the way they're being managed. So the last countryside survey in 2007 showed that only 31% of our hedges were in good condition with appropriately managed margins. And this actually dropped to just 10% in arable areas. And in a lot of cases, this is simply a result of hedges no longer being managed according to their life cycle. So I actually have a bit of a problem with the idea that you can categorize hedges into good and bad condition. It seems a little bit too black and white for my liking. It can confuse condition with value. And sometimes it's just describing the different hedge stage that it's in its life cycle. And what I like is that almost all poor condition hedges can be brought back into being a great habitat, and back into being an asset for a farm with the right management tweaks. Having said that, there aren't that many other polite words to describe hedges such as the one in this picture here. And we do still need to refamiliarise ourselves with the hedgerow management cycle and the clues that a hedge gives us that it's time to progress through it. So when we look at the trend in species that depend on hedges, it doesn't paint a pretty picture. So this is the trend for farmland bird indicator species. And remember that 84% of these species depend on hedges in some way or another. Similarly, again, we've lost half of our dormice since the year 2000, and about the same in our rural hedgehog populations. And sadly, we are seeing similar declines across the board. So this isn't all down to hedges. We know there are several other factors contributing to these declines. It's not just about hedgerow loss or condition. But given that all these species depend on healthy, well-managed hedgerows, making sure we provide these could be a well-needed lifeline for these species. So even if you didn't give two hoots about wildlife, hedge decline isn't great, partly because all of the additional benefits that we're missing out on. So I'm often told that hedges have lost their function, as wire fences are now a cheaper and easier way to control livestock. But to me, that just ignores all of the other practical on-farm and environmental benefits that hedges bring us. That stock-proof fencing isn't their only value. So what have hedges ever done for us? Well, let's start with livestock. Hedges provide really valuable shelter for livestock. So animals without shelter can have higher mortality rates and require more food, both of which are expensive. Shelter increases lamb survival rates because of the reduced effects of wind chill and hypothermia. Then, of course, we also get shade. So in the summer months, heat stress can take a huge toll on our livestock, especially cattle and dairy herds. And you'll often see cows and sheep crowding into the shady areas of the field. So heat stress can reduce milk yields. It can affect fertility. It can affect their growth rates, their immune function, and so on and so forth. Next, we've got diet diversity. So livestock will often be seen browsing on hedge plants and trees, even given a field full of fresh pasture. And really, because this supplementary browsing on diverse plants is really great for them in general. Then we've got biosecurity. So thick stock-proof hedges can act as a barrier to the spread of disease by reducing animal-to-animal contact. And of course, if you're not interested in livestock, hedges can also benefit crops. So hedges, again, provide a windbreak, and this can reduce the damage that high and cold winds can do, such as crop lodging, premature flower and fruit shedding, shoot damage, and chilling injuries. And hedges for crops can also maybe help us reduce our use of pesticides. So they do this by increasing the populations of beneficial insects, such as predatory spiders, ground beetles, parasitic wasps, hoverflies, and all of these can help control pest species by helping prevent them getting out of control. And of course, they also help support diverse populations of pollinators. So they do this really in a couple of ways. Firstly, by making sure there's enough pollinator forage, or flowers, of course, to sustain them throughout the year when our crops aren't in flower. But also by providing areas of uncropped land, which are absolutely essential for pollinator overwintering. Hedges can also reduce soil erosion in two main ways. Firstly, they can reduce the wind speeds, which helps stop blowing dry, loose soil away. But they can also act as a barrier to waterborne runoff. Speaking of water, they play an important role in times of flood. So the plant roots actually help increase the rate at which water infiltrates into the soil. This helps the soil act like a sponge to soak up floodwater rather than allowing it to run off the surface. Now, of course, tree and hedgerow roots are deeper than most crop roots, and this allows like a larger and deeper area of the soil profile to act like that sponge. And water isn't the only thing they soak up. They can also soak up pollution, both air pollution and noise pollution, and also sediments from field runoff. So it helps stop as much of that reaching our rivers. And of course, they also soak up carbon, and this is getting quite a lot of attention at the moment. They store carbon in all of the sort of woody stuff that you see above ground, also in their roots, and also crucially in the soil as soil organic carbon. So their contribution to our fight against climate change is, rapidly being recognised. The IPCC recently recommended we extend our hedges by 40%. CPRE's fantastic new campaign is recommending 40% as well. And the NFU have also highlighted how valuable they think hedges are going to be, hitting their target of net zero by 2040. So how do we increase the carbon in our hedges? Well, I would say lots of ways. So a few tweaks in management, like establishing more hedgerow trees, filling hedgerow gaps, and allowing hedges to be bigger on average. Could be doing a lot more of this before we even get into the idea of planting more hedges. So with 400,000 kilometres of managed hedgerows, many in need of more trees anyway, and many in need of a bit more growth, hedges could actually make a really, really important contribution. There are loads of other benefits sort of hidden in this poster, including things like wood fuel and privacy, but I could be here all day talking about the benefits of hedges if I don't move on quite soon. But what I will say is, as well as all the quantifiable benefits, there are other less quantifiable but extremely important ones. So things like a sense of place and our general well-being. Hedges are a defining feature in our countryside. They have deep and historical cultural importance, and they tell the story of our farming traditions over many centuries. So how do we manage for healthy hedgerows? I'm going to take you through some of the basic principles of hedge management. I'll go quite fast, so it might be a bit of a whirlwind, but here we go. So the first one often comes as a bit of a surprise, but hedgerows do require management in order to stop them developing into a line of trees. So a line of trees might not sound like a bad thing because we all love trees, but actually, as everything competes for light and races upwards, they lose that sort of thick, dense structure at the base, which is so valuable for wildlife. They also get to a point where many of these trees will then topple, it will get gappy, and eventually it will be lost. So okay, we've gathered that hedges need to be cut, but the devil is in the detail. How we cut them and how often makes all the difference. So when they're recently rejuvenated or when they're young, cutting a hedge fairly frequently can be a good thing. So it changes the balance of hormones in the plants, helping to create that wonderful dense structure. So most of our hedge plants respond to the growing tips being cut off by sort of being like a pufferfish. They put on more effort into all of their side branches and their branching growth. If you keep doing this, but cutting slightly higher and slightly wider each time, you end up creating this amazing density of growth that provides such great shelter for nesting birds. So you can do this to help establish that really brilliant structure. But after that, how often should you cut them after that? Well, I would say not every year. Most of our hedge plants blossom and fruit on second year wood. So hedges should absolutely not be cut every year, or most of that potential gets cut off. So the hedge on the left here is actually the same hedge that I was hiding in the original shot at the beginning of the talk. Hasn't been cut for a few years. It's absolutely covered in berries, and earlier in the year it would have been equally covered in blossom. The image on the right was taken just 5 minutes afterwards, just up the same road. It's another hawthorn hedge that's trimmed every year, and as you can see, it is completely devoid of berries. And sadly, cutting every year often goes hand in hand with cutting at the same height. And together this leads to another issue threatening our hedges, which I call chronic over-trimming. So over-trimming not only reduces the value of a hedge to wildlife, but also actually threatens the future of the hedge structure itself. So again, it loses density at the base of the hedge, and I can't stress enough how essential the hedge base is for wildlife. But then stems are lost. And at first, the remaining hedge plants kind of stretch to fill the space, which often reminds me of this painting. But then as more plants are lost, the more difficult this becomes. And this starts to form gaps in your hedge, which will extend if the management doesn't change. But luckily, this is completely avoidable. I would say cutting just 10 centimetres higher and 10 centimetres wider each year can make all the difference. So you'll avoid the structural damage and the scar tissue of cutting at the same height each year. You keep a border of young wood around the edge, so you will always have flowers and fruits, even on cutting years. And you get that wonderful, thick, dense hedge that's so good for birds. And if you're worried about it getting unmanageably big, well, if you cut 10 centimetres higher every time, and you're cutting on a 3-year rotation, it will take you 30 years before it gets a metre taller, which really isn't that desperate. Even if you're cutting a hedge every year, it will still take a decade to get a metre taller. So it's not really a huge concern, especially if we're after bigger hedges anyway. And after that, if space allows, it's great to put them into a period of no intervention, where you just let them grow out for a decade or so. At which point you might want to think about rejuvenating them. I will skip over that one because I think I'm running short of time. And lastly, no matter how well you manage your hedge, it will at some point need rejuvenation. So this could be laying or it could be coppicing, but essentially it resets that hedgerow cycle. So it thickens a hedge back up from the base, and from there you can start the whole process again. So this photo shows a recently and beautifully laid hedge. I didn't lay this hedge, by the way. This was where one of Nigel Adams is. But hedge laying is essentially where you cut the stem of a hedge almost all the way through at the base. You bend it over and you bind it in place. It's a very crude description of a very skilled job. So I hope there aren't too many hedge layers listening. So the low cut encourages plentiful new shoots from where the stem was cut, and that will really thicken out from the base. And the existing stem that's bent down, actually they get wound together to create this instant living stock-proof fence, which I think is pretty genius. So again, this resets that cycle of succession and allows a fresh start for a hedge. So if this rejuvenation part of a hedge management stops indefinitely, it doesn't matter how you manage the hedge in the meantime, the hedge will inevitably decline. So I would actually, I mean, it's amazing when you think about it. Every ancient hedge that we still have today, even those dating back hundreds and hundreds of years, all of them exist today only because perhaps once in a generation or twice in a generation, each hedge has been laid. So I just think it's incredible to think that the reason we have so many ancient hedges is thanks to this unbroken chain of care, management, and periodic rejuvenation. Hedges are essentially made immortal only through the management passed from farmer to farmer, hedge layer to hedge layer, generation to generation. And actually, sadly, hedges will only survive if we offer them similar care and consideration going forward. So this is what all of that looks like in one poster. This is the hedge management cycle, and it's my favourite diagram of all time. It's based on the fantastic work of Nigel Adams. And what it shows is that hedges are dynamic, living habitats, and they need dynamic management based on their life cycle. They aren't just green walls, and they cannot be treated as such. It's not possible to keep a hedge at any one point of this life cycle for too long without seeing structural decline. Some decline faster than others, and some so slowly that you'd barely notice the change, but they will still be declining. So it might look a bit complicated at first sight, but what I love about this diagram is that it shows no matter what stage your hedge is in, there is a way of bringing it back into being in a healthy condition. So in the centre here, there's the dense and the well-managed hedges. So these include rotational cutting, incremental size increase, periods of non-intervention, but crucially, it will always include some form of rejuvenation. And depending on how you manage your hedge, you may only need to rejuvenate your hedge every sort of 30 or 40 years. The problems in hedge management are represented on the two side flanks. So on the left, you have the hedges that have become overstood. As I mentioned before, they will lose their vegetation at the bottom and sort of turn into lines of trees. And on the right-hand side, you've got the process of over trimming. So trying to keep a hedge in the same box shape for too long. Again, it loses structure at the base, develops this sort of hard knuckle at the trim line, loses stems and becomes gappy. I would say these ones are probably a priority to fix, because not only are they disappearing slowly in front of us, they're actually not really fulfilling any of their benefits in the meantime, not to wildlife, not to the climate, or to us as land managers. And of course, none of this is really reinventing the wheel, but actually reflects traditional hedgerow management. So this quote here comes from a book written in 1573, and it says, "Take a sharp hatchet or handbill and cut the septs in a plain place nigh unto the earth, more than half asunder, and bend it towards the earth, and wrap and wind it together, and it shall need no more bending for many a year." And what I love about that quote is that, written in 1573, it almost exactly matches the technique of hedge laying that we still use today. It wasn't new then, it was just, the first written record of this essential practice. So at the top here, we've got a hedge that's been laid. And sometimes hedges were then just sort of left to grow out again before relaying, and they'd sort of be laid, left, laid, left, and that will be their cycle. But of course, sometimes they'd also see periods of trimming. And the trimming really kept that density of the hedge that I was talking about earlier, but also could slightly extend the amount of time before relaying was needed. But of course, back when hedges were trimmed by hand, so this is the tool that this land girl is using in this picture is actually a little bit, it's called a slasher, and it's a bit like a billhook on a long stick. When they were laid by hand with these slashers, they would inevitably not take off all of the year's growth. The oldest bits were already woody and tough, and it actually meant that hedges got slightly bigger at every cut, exactly as we recommend with incremental trimming. It's not a new idea. And when it got too big to trim in this manner, it may have been left to grow out for a while. As soon as it starts thinning at the base, it would be laid again, and it would start that cycle all over again. So a lot of the changes that we saw last century, most of which have sort of broken the tradition of rejuvenating hedges in favour of repeated trimming at the same height. And really this happened just because we got better machinery. We got tools that made it easy to cut a hedge to the same height every year. And actually that had never really been the case before. And this meant that there was no steady increase in size, and so fewer got to a point where they were getting rejuvenated. And while hedges can cope for this for several years, we are now seeing the impacts of what this is doing to the hedge structure if continued in the long term. And there are lots of clues that hedges can give us if we learn to speak their language, that they need a change in management. So here are a few images, but I've made a whole library called Reading Hedges that can help you understand many of these indicators, which you can find on our hedgerow survey website. Speaking of hedgerow surveys, if all of that was a lot to take in at once, you're in luck. We've created not one, but two hedgerow surveys to help. So firstly, our Great British Hedgerow Survey. This is aimed at volunteer groups, wildlife groups, parish groups, etc. It takes about 20 minutes to do per hedge. Needs to be done when hedges are in leaf, as you do count species. And it provides us with really high quality data about hedgerow health. So this data at a national level will show us hedge trends, which can help us direct our conservation efforts, as well as sort of headline messages that we can share. It also provides immediate and instant feedback, not only about the health of the hedge, but also advice about what you might do in the future in terms of hedgerow management. And on the right there, we've also created a new app called Healthy Hedgerows, which is a free rapid assessment hedge management app designed specifically for farmers and land managers. So this is actually just 6 questions. It's quick and simple to use, and it gives instant management advice for each hedge surveyed, largely, again, based on that hedgerow life cycle. So while it's easy to apply that hedge life cycle to 1 or 2 hedges, to do this across a whole farm is a lot more difficult. So which is where the sort of the speed and the simplicity of the Healthy Hedgerows app comes in. So, you know, whether you're interested in just bringing a few hedges back into traditional management or all of them, this is designed as a simple tool to help. So this app was developed as part of Close the Gap, which is a Green Recovery Challenge Fund project. It's completely free to download and use, and it always will be. If you don't have a smartphone, we've actually replicated the functionality on our Hedge Survey website as well. And this one it's very quick to use. It provides management advice, and it's really just there as a tool to help get people back in the swing of managing their hedges on a life cycle. So what do we ultimately want to see? Well, I want to see hedges bigger, better, and more joined up. I want to see them fulfilling their potential economically, ecologically, and environmentally. And at the moment, I don't think they really are. I want to see them managed on a life cycle, including rejuvenation. I want to see fewer gaps and more trees. So I hope I've convinced you that hedges are incredible, fascinating, and valuable beyond measure. But what now? So how can we all help? So if you own a hedge, I would say take a closer look at it. Look at its structure, its health, and make sure that you're managing it dynamically according to its life cycle. I would also say, if you own hedges, show off the amazing hedges that you're creating. Make all of your neighbours jealous with the big, bountiful, beautiful hedges that you can grow. So hedges are possibly the most visible aspects of the way we farm, but our pride in them doesn't need to come from their neatness. Instead, we can boast about the berries, their flowers, and take pride in all of the other things that they're doing for us. Now, if you don't own hedges, there are still plenty of ways that you can directly help. So, of course, firstly, I would say get out and get surveying. There are fantastic groups up and down the country working alongside farmers and landowners, providing these health checks and sharing the management advice with the farmers themselves. The next thing I would say is you can tag young hedgerow saplings to spare them from the trim. I was chatting to someone the other day who's doing this, and it's fantastic. He said all the trees in the hedges near him were old, so he was worried about, you know, that the trimming regimes weren't allowing new hedge trees to come through. So he chatted to his local farmer down the pub, who completely agreed. So this chap is now marking potential young hedgerow saplings with colourful sticks, and the farmer has instructed the contractor to avoid them from the trim. So it's a very simple, elegant solution that benefits everyone. Next, you can speak to your local council. Again, I spoke to another amazing individual recently who has been writing to her council to ask whether they could update their hedge cutting regimes in light of the climate and wildlife crisis. And now they're working together to put a more dynamic plan in place for their local council managed hedges. So amazingly, would you believe, councils still get complaints about how tidy people want their hedges. I would also say we need to be balancing this narrative, saying that we actually want hedges that fulfill lots of different things, not necessarily neatness. I would also say, if you have the space, think about setting up a community nursery. So by planting saplings from locally collected tree seeds, you could be making sure that some of that gorgeous and essential genetic diversity is maintained. So our hedges are our Noah's Ark of tree genetic diversity. And when we can work with farmers or the community, where these young plants can then be used maybe to fill hedgerow gaps or to establish new trees. And lastly, I'd say go out and look at the hedgerows around you. See what you can see in them, enjoy them. Look at the plants, the insects, the birds, and I guarantee that when you get a greater appreciation for the humble hedge, you will find yourself coming up with your own new and imaginative ways of helping. And if you do, please do let me know. So our turn, what are we doing to help? Well, firstly, we've created these 2 surveys which both collect information for us to understand what's happening to hedges on a national scale, but also to deliver valuable feedback about their management to landowners. So as the old adage goes, you can't improve what you don't measure. Understanding how healthy our hedges are is critical to help us understand how we can help both now and in the future. So it helps us direct our conservation efforts, our messaging, and also the policy that we seek. But we are also talking directly to farmers and other groups that directly manage hedgerows across the country. So through leaflets, talks and farm walks and more. If you are part of a farm cluster group or similar that would like a hedge afternoon, please do get in touch. And we're also working in partnership with some other brilliant organisations that are all working together for the benefit of hedges. So at the moment, we're delighted to be working with Close the Gap Partnership. And this is with the Tree Council, the University of Reading, More Trees, the Farm Wildlife Advisory Group, HedgeLink and more. And that's a project that covers hedge planting, advice, our Healthy Hedgerows survey, research, and supporting community nurseries, but also crucially raising awareness about how amazing and valuable these hedges are. And of course, alongside CPRE, we're part of HedgeLink, which is a partnership that brings together everyone that's interested in hedgerows. We share knowledge and ideas, encourage and inspire, and we work with farmers and other land managers, basically to conserve the hedgerows and heritage. So it's a collective of conservation organisations, farming, hedge laying, and more. And this can include working on research, sharing information, but also collaborative projects and looking at things like hedgerow policy and any forthcoming policy that might affect our hedgerows nationally. And now is quite a hot time for that, actually. There's quite a lot of policy changes at the moment. So I think the future is good for hedgerows. They've been with us in some form since at least the Bronze Age, and they've already weathered some pretty turbulent times. So last century wasn't the first time, and I doubt it will be the last time, that politics has played a big impact in our hedges. From land enclosures to riots and uprisings, the history of hedgerows really is quite fascinating, almost as fascinating as their wildlife. But we are beginning now to realise and recognise how many ways hedgerows benefit us on so many levels. So there is a huge growing interest at the moment in making sure that they survive and thrive. So this is a bit of a timeline of the history of hedges that I put together. And this blue bit at the end here is where we are now. So the privilege of caring for hedges and the responsibility of ensuring that they have a healthy future now falls to us, because we are the ones that write the next chapter in their history books. So I would say, for goodness sake, let it be a good one. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Megan. I couldn't find my stop button there. What a brilliant talk. So quite an interesting talk as well. And as you can expect, you've intrigued everybody because you've got a whole host of questions. So I hope you don't mind. I hope everybody enjoyed that. What we will do is I will go to the top and read through the questions. If you are the person whose question I'm reading out, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to get involved in elaborating on your question, by all means. And if you can't find the unmute button, which should be in your bottom left-hand corner, do just give me a wave on the camera if your camera is on. Otherwise, I drop another message. So let me scroll through, find your first question. Okay, so we have a question here from an unnamed source. Do dormice come into the house? We get mice in the attic and trap and release them. Is there anything special we should do if we find dormouse?
It's unlikely, but not unheard of. So I would say the sort of most common place that you might find dormice inside tends to be garages. They don't tend to like going inside actual houses or roofs. You may be potentially confusing for them for the edible dormouse, which a sort of more recent introduction. But dormice, I would say very unlikely for you to find them in your house.
Thank you. I'll move to Tina's next question. Tina, I echo your comments here, actually. Absolutely gutted to see a neighbour grubbing up several ancient hawthorns from relic hedgerows this summer. I think that's more of a statement than a question, and one I'm sure we all agree on.
Yeah, I will add to that. We do actually have policy that helps protect hedgerows, especially in the agricultural sector. But any hedges that are in the curtilage of a house aren't covered by that. So there are still gaps in our hedgerow protection. But again, something that we would like to be working on at some point.
A question here from Susan. Are we making progress in halting hedge cutting, especially in the hard cutting back by tractors?
We are definitely trying. What's quite difficult actually is that we used to have something called the Countryside Survey, which was a fantastic scientific rigorous survey that took place over the whole of the UK every 10 years, and it looked at the health of all of our habitats. Our last one was it's where all of our hedgerow stats come from as well, so it's an absolute goldmine of data. But unfortunately, the last one that happened was in 2007, and it looks unlikely that it's going to get funded again to the same extent. So there is a gap in data, which is part of the reason that we thought doing these hedgerow surveys was so essential now, because there is a huge gap in the data of what we know about hedgerow health. We certainly are encouraging, as our government schemes, encouraging more relaxed trimming regimes. And actually, it's very good to see that in the new sustainable farming incentives, it's just the pilot at the moment, but what's going to essentially replace the old agricultural schemes, there are incentives for not just relaxed trimming regimes, but also incremental size increase. So not cutting a hedge back to exactly the same point as it was cut before, but slightly bigger. And that's, I believe that's the first time that we've actually seen that reflected in government schemes. So it's really encouraging to see that's being reflected.
Thank you. Caroline has a small farm and she's laid lots of hedges, but would be interested to know what alternatives there are to flail cutting. The contractor that she uses only has this method currently, but she feels that it seems so brutal.
It's an interesting one. I think a lot of people assume I'm going to be anti-flail because I work in conservation and hedges, but I'm actually not. I just think, as I was saying with the hedge slashers that used to cut hedges slightly bigger each year, we can replicate that with a flail. So I would say we don't have to go back to hand tools to be sensitive with how we cut. We can actually just use the tools that we've got now, but just use them slightly differently. So easing off, I call it cutting a hedge green. So if you cut a hedge slightly further out, you've still got that sort of layer of leaves. The hedge should still look green at the end of the cut. And that's because you've eased off with the trimmer and cut slightly further out and slightly further up. So I would say if they have just got a flail, it's as much about how you use the tools as what tools you're using. But of course, if you're doing a relaxed cutting regime, so every 3 years, it will always look brutal when you cut with a flail, because you're going through much older, woodier growth, so it splinters a bit more and it does look a bit harsh. There are other tools that you can use. So if you are going to be doing them on sort of relaxed cutting regimes every 3, 4 or 5 years, you can use something called the circular saw attachments. So it's just a different attachment that goes on the arm of the tractor, and it has a much cleaner cut. So it doesn't do quite so much splintering as the flail will do. But there are a few disadvantages of that as well. The flail kind of mushes everything up and it all kind of disappears at the hedge bottom. Whereas if you use a circular saw attachment, you sort of have to follow the tractor again and do a second pass to sort of pick up all of the bits that have been chopped off. So that there are sort of lots of things to consider when choosing what tools to use on that front.
Okay. Could garden hedges be helpful for wildlife, and if so, what species would be best?
Completely, absolutely. I mean, loads of garden hedges, especially in sort of semi-rural and semi-urban populations areas, used to be agricultural hedges in the first place. I mean, the number of sort of fields that get developed on and an agricultural hedge will turn into a garden hedge. Absolutely, they're valuable. I mean, we've got, I think, 12% of the land in the UK is urban. So again, that's quite a significant proportion of land. And so for wildlife and for connectivity, you know, having good hedges in gardens is really important too. I would say you might want to choose slightly different species if you're having a garden hedge. Probably not things like blackthorn, which makes a brilliant agricultural hedge, but can be a bit of a menace if you've got a small garden. I am a bit of a glutton, so if I'm doing a garden hedge, I will always put lots of edible species in there as well. So I would have a hedgerow tree that maybe has like an apple tree. I'll probably put some nut species in there. I have actually done a hedge made out of black currants as well. Not totally blackcurrant, but just sort of including them in there, making that hedge multifunctional to me as well as for wildlife. So, but maybe including things like hawthorn, which does make quite a good hedge tree as well.
Thank you very much. A question from Dave here. As farmers and contractors are the ones managing the vast majority of hedges, how do you advise they change their normal practice of cutting before autumn and removing the food bank of berries and the exact same height every year?
Oh yeah, it is a difficult one. So the thing about cutting them in September, you're not allowed to cut a hedge until September because it's the bird nesting season. So September is the first time that people are able to cut hedges, and unfortunately that also seems to be the time when a lot of people do cut their hedge. And you know, hedges were classically known as wildlife's larder, and they were supposed to be what fattens birds and mammals up to prepare for winter. But of course, if you cut it in September, you cut it all off before everything has a chance to really feast on it. The problem with suggesting cutting it later, and we suggest where possible, cut it in January or February. The problem at the moment really is that sometimes the soil conditions can't really cope with that. So the soil gets waterlogged, and actually taking heavy machinery on soil in January or February can do more damage in terms of compaction than anything. But actually, this is where things like having a relaxed trimming regime comes into play. So if you're cutting every 3 years, whether you cut it in September or January, you will still at least have some years of fruits and flowers in there. And because when you do a 3-year rotation, you actually tend to do like a third each year, you will always still have some hedges that are providing that food. So we say, yeah, do cuts, you know, wherever possible, late winter, but we, you know, obviously at the same time are aware that sometimes soil conditions just can't tolerate that. But of course, from my point of view, roadside hedges, I don't see why they all get cut in September. It's not like they grow much between September and spring. So if they're a danger to people's health and safety from the road's visibility point of view, they can be cut any time of year. But if by September they're not a problem, then why not leave them till spring? That's my personal opinion.
Caroline, don't apologize for too many questions. Knowledge is power, and we're all here to take something away this evening. You've got 2 questions here. How do you cut laid hedges, and what to do with a hedge which is now a line of trees which the hedge cutting man says is too high to cut now?
Okay, 2 brilliant questions. So cutting laid hedges, I would say, again, it depends on what you've got your hedgerow for. So there's a huge amount of flexibility in the hedgerow sort of management cycle. And some people will lay a hedge and then just let it grow, and then lay it again and let it grow, and don't bother with the cutting at all. But it depends really what you want from your hedge. So an alternative is to do what I suggested with the incremental increase. So again, that creates that kind of wonderful branching structure, because as soon as you take off the growing tip, the apical meristems of the regrowth, it puts its effort into branching. So with a laid hedge, I'd probably leave it a season before you start cutting it. Some people like to cut them by hand or not with a flail for the first couple of years, because that can be a bit of a blunt instrument. But then again, cutting them steadily bigger. You may also want to start training them into a sort of A-ish shape, to keep that base really thick, because the base of a hedge is just, one of the most important aspects of it. And sorry, the other question was what to do with a line of trees that the hedge cutting man says is too high to cut. So you can, some hedge layers are very amazing at turning sort of hedges that are almost lines of trees into laid hedges. If there's no undergrowth at all and it is just a line of trees, that's actually probably the only stage of hedge where it's not really recoverable. But if you think it will respond, you can actually do something like coppicing. So if they're too big to be laid, and at some point, sometimes they are also too dangerously big to be laid, you can do a hedge coppicing, and you can get these fantastic, if you've got a lot of a hedge like that, then you can get tree shears, brilliant, absolutely brilliant tool, which can help coppice a hedge like really efficiently and economically as well. So they will just sort of grab each tree, cut it off at the base and move it along. And again, coppicing, like laying, does the exact same thing. It takes one stem and it turns it into many, because you get lots and lots of regrowth coming from the bottom. And again, from that point, you can like incrementally trim to create a sort of wonderful dense hedge structure. But again, ask a contractor to have a look, give you a quote, and see whether that hedge is worth saving. But I'd say don't cut it all down regardless. Leave some of those trees in there as hedge standards, because again, I can't say enough that we need more trees in our hedgerows.
You may have just attached to answer the next question as well from Suzanne. Is there a less labour-intensive rejuvenation of hedges than laying?
There is. So hedge coppicing is a totally valuable and viable alternative to hedge laying. But there are also sort of varying degrees of hedge laying. So Nigel Adams, who came up with that hedgerow life cycle, also sort of piloted this wonderful new style of hedge laying called conservation hedge laying. So it's essentially the same thing. You cut it sort of 80% of the way through at the base and lean them over, but you don't do all the staking and the binding and all the fiddly bits. And actually it makes it a lot faster, about twice as fast, so about half as expensive. So much more economic than sort of traditional hedge laying with all the sort of twisting and binding of the tops, and really rather effective as well. So I think the regrowth is shown to come back just as strong, and it makes just as valuable a hedge at the end of it.
I'm going to very calmly ask Megan, can you see the chat? Because I seem to have pressed a button which has removed my chat. And if so, could you read the next question?
I can, yes, hold on. Let me see if I could scroll to where we got to.
So sorry.
Can I provide a PDF or PowerPoint of the slides used? I probably can, yeah, that's not a problem. I like to get these messages as far and wide as I can. Is it possible to lay an old hedge that has maybe never been laid before and has some fairly old plants in it and may have got a bit gappy? I would say probably, certainly, unless it's a line of trees, or if it's thicker than this at the base, if each stem's thicker than this, then it gets a bit challenging. But generally, it's quite surprising, how big a hedge can be and still be laid. Personally, I think it's better to lay them slightly earlier rather than later. If you actually rejuvenate a hedge before it starts getting gappy, then you don't need to do the sort of gapping up at the same time, and it responds really well. And it won't have lost the stem density as well, which is a really valuable thing. But if you already have a hedge that's overstood and starting to get a bit gappy, I would say ask a hedge layer to come in and get a quote for you, because sometimes the bigger ones will have stems in it that aren't very easy to lay, but it's difficult to advise without actually seeing the hedge. I'll go back to the questions 1 second.
Sorry, I have found myself now, actually.
Have you found them again?
Yes,
Okay.
sorry. So Chloe's asking, how would you recommend to best manage hedgerows at the roadsides, e.g. on the narrow country roads where the hedge is immediately adjacent to the road edge?
That is a really good question, because obviously you can't do the incremental increase so much on a roadside, nor can you do sort of leaving it on relaxed rotations. And roadside hedges do account for quite a large number of our hedges as well. So it is an important consideration. I would say the other side of the hedge and the top of the hedge can still be managed in the sort of relaxed and incremental systems. And roadside hedges can still be laid, coppiced and rejuvenated. And they do need to be. Like any hedge without rejuvenation is on a pathway to its demise. So they do still need that. But again, you probably do have to keep cutting at the same width on the bit that actually adjoins the road. And you'll see when that starts becoming a problem. So on that cut face along the roadside, that you'll often get a lot of sort of hints that the hedge will give you that it's going to start to struggle with that. So one of them might be that's knuckly scar tissue that you get when you cut a hedge to the same sort of point each time. But also some hedges you'll find sort of have this wall of ivy. Now, ivy is an absolutely fantastic plant for wildlife, brilliant late forage for bees and pollinators. But what it can do is it can form this sort of layer at the cut face of a hedge, and it's shade tolerant species. What it will do is start shading out the rest of the hedge and hollowing out that hedge. And so if that starts happening, it's a bit of a clue that the hedge needs a little bit more attention. And that might just be reshaping it to sort of reset where that line is, or it could be rejuvenating the hedge as well. But again, the side that's not facing a road and the height of the hedge, those can still be managed dynamically, if not that actual cut face on the roadside.
I have a couple of questions here on the app. So I'll use the 2 questions. Can you use the app to manage garden hedges? And how is the survey data used? Would landowners have concerns about the results being shared?
So we've got a data policy about how and where that data can be shared. So we don't just keep it to ourselves, and it can be shared, but it will never be used. It will never be used in an official context. So it's never going to be passed to rural payments or anything to be used as a sort of stick or anything to measure that. So really what it's there for is to provide information to the farmer. So it's there as a tool rather than an exam. It's to help people understand how to sort of transition back to that land management, and actually the data that we gather from it is just of 6 questions, so it's not hugely detailed data to be sharing anyway, but again will never be used in any sort of official payments based context, and generally is there to help us understand the sort of health at a national level rather than on an individual farmer's basis. I mean, we've got all sorts of GDPR policies and stuff, so individual people will never be contacted or challenged for their management.
And we have a couple of questions here on coppicing, as we discussed earlier. Can all hedgerow plants be coppiced? And are there any thoughts on using digger-mounted tree shears for coppicing?
Not all plants can be coppiced, but most traditional hedge plants can. So things that can't be coppiced tend to be anything that's not broadleaf. So sort of pines and things don't do coppicing well. But I would say most traditional plants used in hedging will be absolutely fine being coppiced. They sometimes get to a point where they might be too old even to respond to coppicing, when they've started getting a bit gnarly and a bit sort of rotten at the base. But at that point, that's sort of a point of no return anyway, really. And in terms of using tree shears, I think it's fantastic. You know, it doesn't necessarily do the tidiest job, but once you've taken the bulk of that hedge down, with the tree shears, which is a safer way of doing it than actually just going in there with a chainsaw. You can be left with just the stumps at the bottom, and you can tidy those up with a chainsaw afterwards. So it's much quicker and a much safer way of coppicing a hedge. So actually, I have high hopes that the sort of increased use of these tree shears is going to help encourage more hedgerow rejuvenation, because so many of our hedges need rejuvenating now. It's been sort of decades since many of our hedges have seen any rejuvenation, and I think tree shears could be a really good alternative to laying.
Thank you. Martin, your question about do we have any information on hedge cutting contractors? I would say perhaps contact us at CPRE Shropshire. We've got, I'm sure quite a lot of our trustees know local hedge cutting contractors we can share with you.
It is a difficult one though, because we've tried reaching the contractors as a large group, but it's a difficult group to get the messages through to, because there aren't, while we've got agricultural publications and things, there aren't hedge cutting contract groups or organisations as such. So they are a difficult group to reach, but on a national scale, but they can be reached locally. And what we've actually been saying is speaking to farmers and just saying, they are your hedges and you're contracting these contractors. So tell the contractor what you want and tell them why you want that, and hope that that the contractors will do as you've asked. Because at the end of the day, if you're a farmer, it's your hedge that's being managed. So you have the right to say, we want it done like this.
Caroline asks, where can we find out about more about hedgerow protection?
So the hedgerow regulations, they were created in 1997. I think CPRE actually played a really fundamental role in help creating those hedgerow protections, which is fantastic. The law and the legal protections are outlined on the government websites. So if you just Google hedgerow regulations 1997, it will come up with which hedgerows are protected and for what reasons and in what contexts. So it protects a lot of hedges. Most generally are agricultural hedges, and it outlines sort of the reasons why we think a hedge is important. So we have a legal definition for what an important hedgerow is, and the protections sort of follow that. Again, it doesn't work in all contexts. It was designed very specifically for the agricultural context, and I think there are different protections needed in like a development context and an urban context. But certainly the hedgerow regulations 1997, if you Google that, it should come up with all the details on the government website.
Could you possibly tell us, this is a question from Claire, could you possibly tell us a little bit more or signpost us to how we can find out more about the hedge afternoons? Would they be suitable for a big public park area?
They possibly might be. They're actually really designed for farm groups and farm cluster groups. So cluster groups are a fantastic network of farms locally that come together to discuss issues that sort of affect, the landscape level. So we designed the sort of the hedge afternoons, as I refer to them as, really sort of for farmers and farm cluster groups. There's no reason that the information wouldn't be interesting or useful to other people. But I guess we'd just have to find out a little bit more detail and context, I think.
Rebecca asks, what time of year should she cut her hedges?
I would say January. So that's after wildlife has had a chance to eat all the berries. We have things like field fares and redwings that are winter visitors. They come over from sort of Scandinavia, and they come to us in the winter time specifically to feast on our hedge and our orchard fruit, and they absolutely feast on it. So we want to give them as much of a chance as possible before we cut off any of that remaining fruit. Having said that, we don't want to leave it too late because some birds are now starting to nest earlier and earlier in the season. So I would say January or maybe first half of February but certainly not between March and September, because that's when you've got peak bird nesting season.
I'm going to chop the questions here a little bit because we have another one a bit further down from Rebecca on the same sort of topic. If I trim alternate years to allow second year wood flowers and fruit to produce, then will I lose production that year?
Lose production of on the year that you cut? Yeah, so if you cut every other year, you will get the blossom, because you'll get the blossom on the second year wood. And you will get fruit if you cut later in the year. So the difference between, it's why a third year cut is actually preferable to a second year cut. Because if you do a third year cut, you get blossom on the second year wood, and then you get fruit, and then you get blossom, and you get fruit. But of course, you know, if you have to start cutting the hedges earlier in the season because of, waterlogged land or anything like that, then you do end up cutting off some of the fruit and the berries that it's produced. So yeah, cutting every other year is great as long as you can cut late in the season. Cutting every third year is better.
We have 3 more questions. One from Richard here. Do flails not introduce more disease?
I think that is a commonly held assumption. It does make a lot of sense when you think about it, but as far as I'm aware, there's actually no evidence suggesting that. So of course, you know, it can look absolutely drastic when a flail cuts through a hedge, especially the third year cutting regime. So it's actually something that I face quite a lot. I'll often get photos sent to me of a hedge that's just been cut after a 3-year pause. And people will send me the photos saying how horrific it looks because of all these splinters and stuff. And sometimes you have to remind people that actually it looks this terrible because old wood has been cut through, and that's why it's splintered, and that's why it looks really, really drastic. But actually that's just because it's cutting on a relaxed regime. It's not necessarily because it's gone too far. But as far as I'm aware, now I might be wrong in this, there is no research that actually confirms that it spreads disease more. Hedges do recover quite quickly, even after a third year cut. Having said that, you know, if you use some fingerbar cutters or a sharper flail, I mean, just sharpening the flail can make a big difference to how much a hedge will splinter. But also those rotary blade cutters create a much sort of tidier, neater cut with less of that splintering growth.
I miscounted the questions, but we're on the final question now. From Adrian: can oak be coppiced?
Difficult now. I would say yes. Oak has traditionally been coppiced and pollarded for thousands of years. Pollard oaks live, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands of years even. The problem is at the moment is we're suffering quite a lot from oak mildew. So if you coppice an oak and you get too much regrowth and it happens to be on a bad year for mildew, that can sort of reduce its chances of survival, really. So oak is becoming more difficult, but mildew is you know, more difficult in some areas than it is in others, and more difficult on some years than it is in others. So I'd say depending on its age, it probably still can be coppiced or pollarded, but if it's too old, or if you're in an area that suffers from mildew quite badly, I'd say it's probably advisable not to, just because it will be a bit more vulnerable.
And I think that brings us to the end of the questions, Megan. Thank you ever so much. We have got a flurry of thank yous, inspirational, informative talk, very interesting. A few people have had to leave us early. So just on behalf of CPRE Shropshire, Megan, thank you so much. What a fantastic talk it's been, and thank you everybody for joining us. Today's talk will be made available for you to watch on our website. It has been recorded. It will be available within the next 48 hours, so keep an eye out. Remember that we do have 2 more talks upcoming. So Wednesday the 10th of November, 7 p.m, we have Insects and Hedgerows, and on Wednesday the 8th of December, we have What's in That Hedge. If anybody wants to join our mailing list to receive updates about CPRE Shropshire's hedgerow project, you can do so by going on our website and clicking contact us. We do have more details on our website about our project to create more hedgerows across Shropshire. We're also doing workshops where we'll be training up to about 50 people how to do some hedge laying this winter. We'll also be doing some more talks and walks covering the importance of protecting hedgerows. So if you want to find some more details, go to www.cpreshropshire.org.uk. Before I do go, I'll just clarify that the irony of the image behind me is that this is now a thriving rethreaded hedge. It's not, there's no more block in the middle there. So I quite like that image because it's a success story. So again, thank you ever so much. Unless there are any other questions for Megan, we will finish it there. Thanks a lot. Okay. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye now.
Thank you all.
Is she still there?
No.
Is Megan still there?
Well, it says it there, I don't know.
I'm still here, yes.
Megan, I think somebody tried to capture you then at the
I
end.
think they were, yeah, and I think I got them just too late.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Megan. That was fantastic.
Yeah, brilliant. That was very, very brilliant. It's we sort of got lost there in the end of all these in the periphery of thank yous and inspirational.
That's all right. So many questions as well. It's really encouraging. Questions. It shows that people are engaged, and that's great.
Absolutely. I got lost. I did get lost. I must have clicked something, and I was trying to type something in the background, ready for my notes at the end. So thank you for saving me there. Okay.
That's okay. Pleasure.
Fabulous. Thanks for your time, Megan. Really, really thank you. That's absolutely fine. I like any excuse to